In 1970, the average American father worked a single job, earned about $50,000 in today's money, bought a house for the equivalent of $25,000, owned two cars, supported a family of four, and still had money left over for annual vacations. His wife didn't work outside the home. They had one income. One. Fast forward to today, and the average household needs over $100,000 from two incomes just to afford a lifestyle that's arguably worse than what one income bought 50 years ago. If you've ever felt like you're working harder than your parents did, but can't afford what they had, you're not crazy. Something fundamental broke in the American economy. And today, I'm going to show you exactly what happened, when it happened, and why an entire generation got economically left behind. Let's start with some specific numbers, because this isn't just a feeling, it's mathematical reality. In 1970, the median home price in America was around $17,000. The median household income, remember this is one income because most households had a single earner, was about $9,000. That means the average house cost roughly 1.9 times the annual household income. You could realistically save for a down payment in 2 to 3 years, get a mortgage, and own a home by your mid-20s. Now let's look at today. The median home price in America is approximately $400,000. The median household income, and now we're talking about two incomes because both partners typically work, is around $75,000. Do the math. That's 5.3 times the annual household income. You need more than 5 years of your entire household income before taxes, before any expenses, just to equal the price of the median home. And that's with two people working, not one. But it gets worse. In 1970, the average new car cost about $3,500, which was about 4 months of the median household income. Today, the average new car costs around $48,000, which is about 8 months of median household income. You're paying twice as much of your annual income for a car compared to what your parents paid. College? In 1970, the average cost of a 4-year public university was around $400 per year. Today, it's over $11,000 per year for in-state tuition alone, not including room, board, or books. Adjusted for inflation, college costs have increased over 500% beyond normal inflation rates. Healthcare, childcare, rent if you don't own, all of these essential costs have massively outpaced wage growth. And yet, when older generations look at younger people struggling financially, they say things like, you just need to work harder, or stop buying lattes, or we didn't have it easy either. But the numbers tell a completely different story. This isn't about work ethic. This isn't about avocado toast. This is about fundamental economic changes that shifted wealth away from workers and toward the top.
So what actually happened? Why could one income support a family in 1970, but two incomes struggle to do the same today? There are 4 major economic shifts that destroyed the one-income family model, and most people don't fully understand them. This is the big one. From the end of World War II until about 1973, something beautiful happened in the American economy. When companies became more productive, when workers produced more value, wages grew proportionally. If the company made more money because workers were more efficient, workers got paid more. It was a direct relationship. Between 1948 and 1973, productivity grew by 96% and hourly compensation grew by 91%. They moved together, almost in lockstep. But then, around 1973, something broke. Productivity kept growing. Workers kept getting more efficient, producing more value, making companies more profitable. But wages flatlined. Since 1973, productivity has grown by 77%, but hourly compensation has only grown by 12% after adjusting for inflation. Let that sink in. Workers are producing 77% more value than they did in 1973, but they're only being paid 12% more. Where did that 65% gap go? It went to corporate profits, executive compensation, and shareholders. The workers created the value, but they didn't get paid for it. If wages had continued to grow with productivity like they did before 1973, the median household income today would be around $102,000 instead of $75,000. And remember, that's with one income, not two. Your dad could have earned six figures in today's dollars working a normal job if the economy had continued working the way it did before the 1970s. Normal inflation means things get more expensive over time and wages are supposed to keep up. A dollar in 1970 is worth about $7 today because of inflation. That's expected. But certain essential costs, the things you need to live a middle-class life, increased way beyond normal inflation rates. Housing, as we already covered, went from 1.9 times annual income to 5.3 times annual income. That's not just inflation, that's a structural change. College went up 500% beyond inflation. Healthcare costs have tripled beyond inflation since 1970. Childcare, which barely existed as a major expense in 1970 because one parent stayed home, now costs an average of $10,000 to $15,000 per year per child. Meanwhile, wages only kept up with regular inflation at best. So you're earning roughly the same buying power your parents had, but the things you need to buy to live a middle-class life cost multiples more. It's like running on a treadmill that keeps speeding up while your legs stay the same speed. Eventually, you fall off. Here's a cruel irony. Women entering the workforce in large numbers starting in the 1970s was a good thing for equality, for freedom, for opportunity, no question. But it had an unintended economic consequence that hurt families. When households went from one income to two incomes, total household purchasing power increased. Basic supply and demand kicked in. Housing prices, childcare costs, and other expenses rose to capture that extra income. Economist Elizabeth Warren called this the two-income trap. Families thought having two incomes would make them richer, more secure. Instead, the market adjusted, and now two incomes are required to afford what one income used to buy. You can't go back to one income anymore even if you wanted to, because housing prices, childcare expectations, and the entire economy have been restructured around the assumption that both partners work. And here's the kicker. Even with two incomes, families today have less discretionary income than one-income families in 1970. Why? Because in 1970, housing was 19% of median income, and today it's 33%. Add in childcare costs that didn't exist when one parent stayed home, add in two cars instead of one, two work wardrobes, commuting costs, and the expenses of maintaining two careers, and you're actually worse off financially despite working twice as many total hours. In 1970, the top 1% of Americans held about 23% of total wealth. Today, they hold about 35% of total wealth. The top 10% hold over 70% of all wealth in America. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% of Americans hold less than 2% of total wealth. This didn't happen by accident. Tax policy changed dramatically. In the 1950s and 60s, the top marginal tax rate was over 90%. By the 1980s, it dropped to 35%, and today it's 37%, but effective rates for the wealthy are often much lower due to loopholes, capital gains treatment, and other mechanisms. Corporate tax rates dropped from 52% in 1950 to 21% today. When you tax the wealthy and corporations less, that money doesn't disappear, it accumulates at the top. It doesn't trickle down to workers' wages. It goes into stock buybacks, executive compensation, real estate investment that drives up housing costs, and offshore accounts. The average worker got nothing from these tax cuts except stagnant wages and more expensive essentials. Union membership also collapsed. In 1970, about 27% of American workers were in unions. Today, it's about 10%. Unions negotiated for wage increases, benefits, pensions. Without them, workers have no collective bargaining power, and wages stagnate while corporate profits soar.
Now, let's talk about what this actually means for you, for your life, for your generation. If you're a millennial or Gen Z, you grew up hearing stories about how your grandparents bought a house at 23, had 3 kids by 30, retired with a pension at 65. You heard about how your dad worked one job, came home at 5, had weekends off, took the family on road trips every summer, and still saved for retirement. And then you entered the economy and realized that world doesn't exist anymore. You got a college degree because everyone said you had to, and you graduated with $50,000 or $100,000 in student debt. You worked hard, got a job, and realized your salary barely covers rent, loan payments, health insurance, and groceries. You're in your 30s, and you can't afford to buy a house. You're delaying having kids because you can't afford childcare. You're working 2 jobs or a side hustle just to stay afloat. And then someone from an older generation tells you that you're just not working hard enough, or you're wasting money on frivolous things, or you have unrealistic expectations. But here's what I need you to understand. It is not your fault. You are not failing. The system changed. The rules changed. And nobody bothered to tell your generation that the economic ladder your parents climbed was quietly dismantled while you were growing up. Your parents could afford more on one income, not because they were smarter or harder working or more financially disciplined than you. They could afford more because housing cost half as much relative to income, because college was affordable, because healthcare didn't bankrupt families, because wages grew with productivity, because the economy was structured to benefit workers, not just shareholders and executives. When your parents bought their first house, they weren't exceptional. They were normal. When they raised kids on one income, they weren't heroes. They were typical. The economy allowed normal people to live comfortable middle-class lives without extraordinary effort or luck. That's not the economy you inherited. And here's the thing that really gets me. Your generation is more educated than any generation in history. You're more productive. You work more hours on average. You're more connected, more skilled, more adaptable. And yet you're economically worse off than your parents were at the same age. That is not a personal failure. That is a systemic failure. The American economy made a choice in the 1970s and 80s. It chose to prioritize corporate profits and shareholder value over worker compensation. It chose to privatize education costs and healthcare costs instead of treating them as public goods. Those were policy choices, not inevitable economic laws. So where does that leave us? Is the one-income family dead forever? Can we ever get back to an economy where normal people can afford normal lives without working themselves to death? Honestly, I don't have all the answers, but I do know that awareness is the first step. Understanding what happened, why it happened, and who benefited from it is essential. Because right now the narrative is that young people are failing, that they're lazy or entitled or bad with money, and that narrative serves the people who benefit from the current system. If workers blame themselves instead of demanding systemic change, nothing changes. The truth is, we need massive policy shifts to fix this. We need wages to grow with productivity again. We need affordable housing policies that treat homes as places to live, not just investment vehicles. We need to rebuild worker bargaining power. These aren't radical ideas, by the way. These were the norms in the 1950s and 60s, the era that people romanticize as the golden age of the American middle class. But change requires collective pressure. It requires young people understanding that they're not alone in the struggle, that it's not individual failure, but collective economic reality. It requires voting, organizing, demanding that politicians prioritize workers over donors. It rejects the narrative that you're just not working hard enough. Your parents could afford more on one income because the economy was designed to reward work with a decent life. Your generation can't afford the same because the economy was redesigned to extract maximum profit while keeping worker compensation as low as possible. That's the truth. It's not your fault. It's not because you're not working hard enough. It's because the system changed and it didn't change in your favor. If this video helped you understand what happened, if it validated what you've been feeling, share it with someone who needs to hear this. Leave a comment telling me what cost increase has affected you the most. Is it housing, student loans, healthcare, childcare? Let's talk about it. And subscribe because we're going to keep breaking down the economic forces that shape your everyday life, the things they don't teach you in school, the truth about why everything feels harder than it should be. I'll see you in the next video.